Hi, my name is Rebecca Bartlett, and this is my book. Tort liability is teachers being held liable for their actions that result in student injury. Torts are defined as wrongful acts that cause injury to another person, property, or their reputation, and those injured are entitled to compensation. Tort law provides a framework for determining school and agency liability. There are intentional torts, and there are six common intentional torts, and those are assault, battery, false imprisonment, defamation, mental distress, trespassing on personal property. Assault is defined as an overt attempt to physically injure a person or create a feeling of fear or apprehension of an injury. Battery is the actual deed that is threatened by the assault. It can be as simple as touching or as forceful as a push or throwing an object. False imprisonment is an intentional confinement by physical means or by threats of means that, such as tying students to chairs or locking them in timeout closets, taping students' mouths shut, or any other act of confinement that causes students physical stress. And defamation are false statements that are intended to harm another person's reputation or statements that are intended to injure or expose to hatred, shame, disgrace, contempt, or ridicule. Mental distress is when a person violates the conduct of acceptable boundaries of decency, and that results in a mental reaction such as anguish, grief, or fright. And trespassing on personal property can involve confiscating a student's personal property or interfering with that personal property. Things that are considered harmful or destructive can be confiscated, but they cannot be kept for an extended period of time. There are negligent torts, and these are wrongs that are suffered by people at the hands of someone else who doesn't take proper care to avoid something that is deemed a foreseeable risk. To understand negligence in an educational setting, we're going to analyze the four elements of a negligent tort, and that's duty, breach, proximate, cause of injury. To understand negligence in this educational setting, we're going to first analyze duty. And teachers have a duty to anticipate foreseeable dangers to students and take steps to minimize those dangers. There's breach, and breach occurs when a teacher fails to exercise a standard of reasonable care and therefore breach their duty to protect the well-being of students. There's proximate cause. Proximate cause involves showing that there is a connection between the breach and the teacher's duty, and the student's injury is a result of that breach. The injury requires that there's evidence of a student sustaining actual physical or mental injuries. There is no liability if these injuries cannot be proven. And this is a graphic that demonstrates the different types of liability. So there's fault, and then the type of injury is broken up into injury to a person or property, the types of damages, and then the excuses for the tort. Defenses against the tort do include consent, necessity, and self-defense. And consent is when a person has agreed to participate in the action that harmed them. Self-defense is reasonable force is being used to keep someone from harming you or harming others or touching you in an offensive way. And necessity is using force to prevent something worse from happening. Now we're going to go over some cases that had some tort cases that are important in the school situation. So the first one is Frame versus Como. And what happened here basically is there was a disruptive student that was asked to leave multiple times. He stood to confront the teacher. The teacher grabbed his arm as the student was standing, and he fell into a podium and a blackboard and sustained injuries. The court deemed that the student's actions were provoking enough and disruptive enough, and the teacher did use reasonable force and acted more in self-defense. If something like this was to happen at the Passaic Public Schools, the SRO, the officers in the building would have been notified, the student would have received medical attention, and the teacher might have been suspended pending an investigation. Proactive measures to prevent something like this happening would be proper staff training in handling situations involving disruptive students and having a firm set of procedures that are put in place, such as calling security or administration in these instances. The next case that we're going to talk about is Flanagan versus Canton. And in this case, what happened were students were being disruptive during their physical education class, and the class was being lectured towards the end of class. An individual was being addressed by the PE teacher instead of him supervising the locker room. And during the unsupervised time in the locker room, a student sustained injuries. He was pushed, sustained injuries that required immediate surgery. So the court in this case deemed that the teacher was in fact neglectful of his duties and that the event was foreseeable due to the prior conduct of the student. So he was in fact negligent of his duties. Proactive measures to prevent something like this from happening could include training in handling disruptive students, procedures put in place, maybe security is called or administration is called, ensuring that there's always supervision in all locker rooms, or a no changing policy for PE. So in Passaic Public Schools, we actually do have a no changing policy to prevent things like this. So the students wear their PE clothes on PE days, as opposed to being unsupervised in a locker room. And if this was to happen in Passaic, the teacher might be suspended pending to an investigation. The next case is Fegans versus Levy. And in this case, a student athlete was asked to perform a jump during a track meet, and she claimed she was unprepared and untrained for this activity. When she told the coach, he insisted, and as she was jumping, it resulted in an injury to her knee that required surgery. And the court deemed in this case that the coach did not intentionally neglect or put this particular student athlete in any harm. And he did have her consent to perform the jump. In Passaic Public Schools, what we do is parents and students sign athletic waivers depending upon their age. Teams have multiple coaches and assistant coaches that can bear witness to different events and conversations. Coaches could be suspended if something did occur, and the district would investigate and then reinstate them if the investigation yielded that they were not neglectful. Proactive measures that can be taken to prevent this is have acceptable risk waivers that are signed by the athletes and the parents. So both are aware of the risks that they're undertaking. Athletic guidelines regarding student athletes and the events they will be performing. So students know if they participate in track, they might be asked to do these different events, or also having some sort of procedure in place where parents are made aware ahead of time if a student is going to be participating in an event that is not what they normally would participate. So maybe a day or a week or so in advance, so then the parent can say that they do or do not give consent for their child to perform. Another case that we're going to talk about is Mitchell versus Cedar Rapids Community School and District. And what happened in this case was students cut class and they met up, had a planned sexual encounter, and it involved an appropriate age difference. There was 4 years age difference between these two students. The court deemed that the district was neglectful in monitoring the students' whereabouts and failing to inform the parents in a timely fashion of the student's absence. So the teacher did mark the students absent. They do have a system in place where the parents were supposed to be notified. So the teacher in this case did what the district had asked her to do, but the students were still unaccounted for. And it wasn't until 6 months later that the student told her mother what had happened. So to proactive measures to prevent something like this are proper training and staff in handling situations involving absentee students, procedures put in place such as calling home, notifying truancy officers. In Passaic Public Schools, we do take attendance every class, and we use a system that is supposed to immediately notify parents of a late or an absence. The office and administration will be notified. Truancy and SRO officers would be notified. Parents would be notified. Cameras would be checked in case a student that should be present was unaccounted for in class. And the last case we're going to talk about is Hiltz versus the Board of Education of Gloversville in Large School District. And what happened in this case was a student slipped in a slushy pathway. Her mother was dropping her off at school. Her mother was still present, and her mother chose to take her home. So the mother went to get the car, and the nurse was standing with the student and supporting her physically. The mother pulled the car up. The mother was still in the car, and the nurse let go of the student for the student to walk into the car. The student fell and then hurt her ankle. So the negligence claim was filed, and it was dismissed, but is being appealed on the grounds that the nurse assumed responsibility for supporting the student, and it was her duty to see her safely to the car or hand her off to her mother. So initially the courts rejected this, but the family is appealing because they do feel that she assumed a responsibility, and once assumed, had to complete it, and her lack of completing that assumption of responsibility led to the child hurting her ankle. Proactive measures are always proper maintenance, proper physical maintenance of the building, and knowing when to assume certain acts. So being that the mother was present, maybe the nurse should not have assumed to have held the child, and have injury procedures in place. In my district, we have doctors that are assigned to treat injuries, so specific places that people will go to. The injury would be immediately reported to the SRO officers, the police officers, and they would begin writing their reports. Exterior cameras would be reviewed, there would be an investigation, and all of the incident reports would be filled out. So anyone can be subject to a lawsuit, and practicing good judgment will minimize the risk by following a professional set of ethics. So such things as performing your duties as assigned. So some of them are boring and repetitive, call duty and lunch duty, but they're very important. And if something happens and you're assigned to be there and you're not there, there could be disastrous consequences. Providing appropriate safety instruction. So there are certain times, certain teachers, certain classrooms where things are being used and they potentially could be dangerous to students or others. So going over the rules and the procedures, posting them, reiterating them to ensure that the conditions are always safe inside the school and outside of the school. And adhering to the school discipline rules, not just making up your own, but using the discipline rules that are on paper, that are on the websites, that are in place, and being consistent with those rules. And then also keeping private information private. So not gossiping, not sharing information about students with people who are unauthorized to have that information, not discussing um, personal information about colleagues and things like that. So thank you for viewing my presentation on tort liability. Thank you very much.